I think slavery in this context is so fascinating, and especially in our current cultural context, we have such a different perspective on slavery than what was looked at here.
Yeah, no, that's actually facts. That's completely true. Matter of fact, do you actually want to talk about that real quick?
Sure.
Or, so, because I know like a whole bunch of people are like, slavery? The Bible supports slavery? That's,
Oof.
yeah, let's just say that's a completely misunderstood topic, actually. I'm actually curious, what is like the most wild thing about that topic that you've probably heard, like relating to the Bible and stuff?
Oh, I hear people say that the Bible supports slavery.
Oh, that's it? That's about it? When it comes to like that topic?
Yeah, I mean that's the most common
Yeah.
wild thing I've heard.
Yeah, no, dude, I've heard that Christianity is the white man's religion. That I
That's
know
interesting.
that is very. If anyone does not know, Christianity came out of the Middle East, okay, where white people are not really prevalent in, if that like makes sense. It's more darker skinned people, Middle Eastern people.
So those unfortunate paintings of white Jesus. That's
yeah, that is very true. But just getting straight into it though. So I got a quote by Sam Harris. Talking about the Bible, and he said, in assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it is useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible, and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly accepts us to keep slaves.
Okay, who is Sam Harris?
So Sam Harris is actually a big time, I think he's a big time atheist. I also believe he's a neuroscientist. Just a very, very smart man, I would say. Great philosopher. I actually like watching some of his videos. He's really, really cool to watch. Not hating on Sam Harris at all. But I will say, though, that this is very disheartening to hear, especially hearing him talk about this. I remember watching one video with him talking to Ben Shapiro, actually, about the Bible and about religions in general and how they're just not too useful. Well, he wasn't. Let me say this. He was not saying they were not completely useful, but he was just saying they're probably not the best route at all. I don't want to misquote him or represent him. But I will say, with how intelligent and how smart he is, this is very disheartening to see on how just blatantly wrong he is just on this topic. I mean, This is, honestly, I don't even hear too many atheists besides him or anyone else that really brings this up, just because if you read it in its context and actually take the time to look at it, it's just not true. So the passage that he reads or suggests to read is Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 through 46, which says, "As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around about you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness." Okay, so let's just talk about the logic that most people probably use in this moment.
Right.
Because I will say that does sound pretty bad. Doesn't sound too good.
Yeah.
So the logic that typically goes is that, the Bible translations do have the word slave and talk about slaves. The Old Testament seems to give no objection to having slaves. The New Testament does not command the release of slaves. And slaves are told to submit, which we have into the New Testament as well. Therefore, Bible texts approve of slavery. We know that slavery is wrong, just the modern person. The Bible not giving any clear stop to it, therefore the Bible must be wrong. And because the Bible is wrong, therefore God is not good.
Right.
That's typically how it goes. My thing, first off, just looking at this is, I first want to look at when was this written, who was writing it, and is this seen the same way that we saw it? Because typically when we use the word slave, I know from the jump, I'm instantly thinking of the Atlantic slave trade. Straight up, just from the jump, people capturing one another, people doing things like that, harshly treating slaves, honestly, the next thing that comes to my mind is sex slaves, sex trafficking, all just a whole bunch of like horrendous, horrific things.
Right.
Honestly. Yeah. But the thing is, though, is that a lot of that stuff happened before this. Or my bad, a lot of that happened much, much later after this.
Yeah.
And so what I think is really interesting is that the first thing we should think about is it inherently wrong for someone to be doing forced labor? So what I think about is prisoners. There's many countries that have prisoners do forced labor because of the things that they committed. Is that wrong? What are your thoughts on that?
Man, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of messed up systems inside prison systems. There's a lot of data to show that rehabilitation works a lot better than punishment. And so then if you're looking at work, forced labor, you might consider as punishment. Unless there's maybe there's training involved or something unlike that, then maybe you can consider it rehabilitation or something like that. But I think it's an interesting topic. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you my view.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just keep it real with you. If we're talking about prisoners or like a rapist or serial killer or just someone who's like obviously like has done the crime,
right,
and needs the punishment, things like in that situation, I think there's no problem with having forced labor in that scenario because that's the punishment. Yeah. Just like no one would have bat an eye if a serial killer went to prison and spent his life there. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like, yeah, of course that should happen. You know? So from the jump, we can just automatically say that right there is somewhat of a level of slavery. You know what I'm saying? So I think that is really interesting. And then not only that, what's fascinating is that that's actually different from the type of slavery in this context with the Bible. So we can actually get into it right now. So the understanding of the word slave in the Bible is heved. Now, what does heved mean? What is heved, and how is that done inside the Old Testament or inside the Bible in general? So what we actually learn is that it doesn't mean slave. It actually means servant. And what I actually found even more interesting is that it's not entirely a negative term like how we see it.
Right.
And then it is related to work, and it does mean subservient. But what is interesting, though, is that I even noticed even that way of seeing subservient is actually very different from the way we see subservient. So would you say that like subservient is like definitely someone beneath you, like not equal, nothing like that, just completely?
For sure.
That's I would say that's the same way. Like that's how I would see subservient as well. How we're not equal. Someone's below me. They don't get the same rights, or they don't get the same attention, or they don't get the same privilege. Right.
Right.
Well, in this context, what we actually find is that they did see each other as subservient, but not in the same way as that. So, for example, what I mean by that is, let's say I have my brother, right? And I'm older than my brother. I have more wisdom. I have more experience. I have more just time on this earth to help give him wisdom. Now, would I say my brother is subservient to me? Obviously, inside this modern time, no, I wouldn't. Right. He's completely equal to me. Matter of fact, the only reason why I'm telling him to do stuff or giving him advice or anything that's more of like a mentorship type of role is out of love and to help him, if that like makes sense. Yeah. I would say that's actually more of like how that word is understood inside that time paper, or that's how it was supposed to be understood, or how that was the intent of it. Another thing too is that they actually saw everyone being subservient to something or being a slave to something. And I think that's even more interesting too, is that they saw the people being servant or slaves to the king, and the king was a servant or slave to God. That's actually how they saw the role or the word slave back then. Matter of fact, if you actually look into the Bible of any moment to where you see the word slave and you look to the original Hebrew and it says heved, that right there actually means servant. And the only other time where you actually see slave getting to the level of how me and you understand it as like horrendous, horrific, right? Right. Is in Exodus. Exodus where it starts describing what's happening to the Jews, what's going on. And ironically, it uses the word slave, and then it uses all this other context to try to express what's actually happening, just because this slavery is very different than this type of slavery.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Because they just don't have the separate words like how we did back then. Does that like make sense?
Yeah, I think even when you're talking about subservient, it's always put in a question of like, well, in what ways is that subservient? Like, I'm subservient to my boss. My boss has more responsibilities. My boss gets paid more. My boss has more experience. I do what my boss says. Like, that is how my job works.
100%. Yeah. I would say the same thing with my parents. I would 100% say I am subservient to my parents, not in the way of like I'm below them or that I'm not of any worth or value, but that they're older than me. I'm going to take their wisdom. I'm going to listen to their counsel, because I would say not only because that's the right thing to do, but because that's also the wise thing to do, and because in a sense that's their role. Does that like make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say in the same way, that's a lot of how the servant or the subservient view of the word was used back then, which I also thought was very interesting, because that also goes into what are you a slave to? Are you a slave to your own desires? Are you a slave to the culture? Are you a slave to politics? Are you a slave to something rather than God? And ironically, we also see in the New Testament, Paul calling himself a slave to Christ, because Christ owns him, because Christ laid down his life as a penalty for him. Does that like make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think this right here actually gets into some deeper, like, I would even go as far as to say like intellectual type of things as well, as like, what are you selling yourself to? What are you becoming a slave to? Are you becoming a slave to porn? Are you becoming a slave to controversy? Are you becoming a slave to hot controversial topics that aren't really doing anything for you? Are you becoming a slave to gambling? You can become a slave to many things. And I would say that is definitely the motif that seems to be happening in this time period, or in this moment, at least I would say inside the Hebrew scriptures and the Hebrew context and system of slavery.
Yeah.
Now, this is to not say that they did everything right and that the Hebrews didn't have a bad form of slavery. There could have been very well many Hebrews and many people that did not do the thing the way it should have been. I mean, if we just look at our own culture, there's people who's getting around laws all the time, doing things that they don't supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But I would say that that's a time to definitely look at that person and judge that person, but not judge the intentions of the text. Does that like make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Just one quick thing too is to kind of look at the essence of the system back then as well. Was if you look at Genesis 15:3 with Eleazar of Damascus, he was a servant or slave, and he was able to inherit things. Same thing with Jacob's servants, or you can also say slaves. They were also able to inherit stuff like that. Not only that, but we also have to remember that back then, there was not immense amount of jobs to also do either. Does that like make sense? So it wasn't like I can just go and work for big tech, or I can go and work at a bank, or I can go work at a grocery store. Nah, like it was either I was a soldier, blacksmith, farmer.
Or you were working for one of those.
Yeah, or you were working for one of those. I mean, there was not much you can really do. Domestic servants and herdsmen. That's really, I don't know what else to tell you. But what I think is also very interesting, too, is that the slaves back then, at least inside the biblical structure of it, was that they were allowed to travel with valuables, and they were allowed to also have weapons. Be honest with you. If I was thinking about slavery in the way that how it was done back then, that does not sound too wise to allow a slave to have a weapon.
Yeah.
Like, that just does not make any sense whatsoever. Or to have valuables. It just doesn't make sense. What you also notice, too, is the conditions of slavery in different systems. So, if you just look and compare when it comes to the Old Testament and the Roman Empire, like celebrating holidays, the Old Testament slaves were allowed to celebrate holidays. Romans did not allow their slaves to celebrate holidays. I believe in Western society they did. I'm not entirely sure, though.
Okay. I don't know either.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. But Old Testament slaves supposed to keep their slaves fully fed. Not only that, actually, but the slaves back then, they were supposed to be seen as family. They're supposed to be taken care of. Matter of fact, actually, if you were to read a lot of the portions that do talk about slavery in the Bible, right after talking about it, the same phrase that you constantly see brought up is, "You were once a slave in Egypt. Do not treat them harshly, because you know how it was to be treated harshly." So it's that same concept of that golden rule, treat someone like how you would like to be treated,
right,
or love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
It's that same thing reiterated again and again and again and again after each time it talks about slavery. But we'll get more detailed in like verses that do talk about it. But sexual protection, kidnapping, chains, torture, physical abuse, all these things were not allowed, except for obviously the sexual protection. Women and slaves were sexually protected. But everything else, kidnapping, torture, physical abuse, you were not allowed to do at all, actually. Matter of fact, there is one portion, a lot of people like to quote this one verse where it does talk about you hitting your slave or something like that. And they just leave it at that. Basically, you don't get any punishment. But ironically, if you actually keep reading, I believe it's in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44, somewhere around there, where it does talk about slavery. It talks about a slave and you hitting your slave. And if the slave can walk the next day or something like that, you're good. You won't. You won't get any punishment. Ironically, people just love to not keep reading. If you keep reading, right after that, it ends up talking about how if you were to hit a slave and that mark or something like that was to last longer, or if it was to lose a tooth, then you get punished for hurting that slave.
Right.
Now, from the jump, I would obviously say that there's probably a cultural misunderstanding right there. If you're allowed to hit your slave, and then on top of that, if the punishment or something like that is too harsh, then there's repercussions. So that means that you're not allowed to just do whatever you want to that slave. More in a sense of like, I would say a good understanding of it is almost like your parents disciplining you in a sense. Obviously, your parent should not be doing something that's like crazy, like abuse.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Now, obviously, I know some people would say a belt, stuff like that is abuse nowadays. I was raised differently. I would just keep it a band, but some people would say that is abuse. To the people who don't think it is abuse, it's slightly different in a sense. It's more like disciplinary. Now, even in those situations too, as well, that was even looked down upon culturally. So even that was not like, I guess, a thing that you were supposed to be doing.
Right.
Does that like kind of like make sense?
It does. I do think some people still look at it and say, no, it's still too far to even hit, a servant or a slave.
Yeah.
That's still too far. Right. Especially if we're comparing it to, employees or workers today. Like, obviously you're not going to hit an employee.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with that. And with that, I would definitely say that that kind of goes into the more of like the cultural understanding of stuff too. Because even with that, like I would say, for example, in different cultures, you have different levels of respect or different levels of to way to even communicate. Like a great example was, I remember just at work, I was trying to help a customer, and in order for me to help him, I actually needed him to fill out a certain amount of things first, just so I can get him into the system and help him out with some stuff. And because I didn't answer his question right away, or no, actually not even that, because I simply asked him to fill this stuff out first, he lost it. Like he was like pissed. No, I mean like genuinely pissed. Like he was like stomping, cussing me out, like just yelling. Now, obviously that was like, I would say, because it was definitely clear that like he was from a different culture,
right,
and stuff like that. Because like the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, just the whole nine. Like you could tell that he was from a different culture. From that point, he took it as like disrespect, the fact that I didn't answer his first question. And then after that, I actually did try to explain, like, I can't do anything until you like fill this type of stuff out so I can actually help you with this particular subject. So, but because I didn't go straight into that, could I have done better? Of course. But with other people, I would definitely say in this culture, they didn't take it as disrespect. They just saw, oh, I got to do this first, and then we can get straight on to business. You know, he on the other hand took it as completely disrespectful. Like, I would probably say, I feel like more than that, it was crazy. Yeah. But I would definitely say inside that same way how there's like different levels of punishment or different levels of disrespect. I could kind of see that as well inside the Old Testament system as well.
Right.
Not only that too, but I feel like there was just a lot of stuff that was also more harsh. I mean, for example, culturally, I believe around Jesus' time, like if a thief was caught stealing, their hand got cut off.
Yeah.
We obviously would not be saying anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So my main point is to obviously not say that the law was perfect, but it is definitely to say though that this is a different type of slavery than most that we see. 100% definitely different than what we saw, like, for example, in like the movie 12 Years a Slave, or, you know, some just other craziness. Does that like make sense?
No, absolutely. And I think people generally have like a cultural superiority where they look at other cultures through their culture.
Yeah.
You know, and you see other cultures that look at the U.S. and they're like, tipping? Why would you tip?
That's actually very, that's a good point.
You know, why would you do this thing? Why would you do that thing? Why do you wear shoes in a house? Why do you do these? You know, there's so many different things that other cultures look at the American culture and they go, why would you do those certain things?
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit different now when you're looking at cultures, cross cultures, and globalization of cultures have become a lot more similar.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a long time ago, so culture is going to look very different.
Yeah.
Looking through our lens to looking at, you know, Leviticus and Deuteronomy and even Paul and Philemon, of like that culture is going to look very different than what we're looking at today.
Vastly. Honestly, that's actually, I would say, one of the biggest things too of like the different cultures between the Jews and the Gentiles, which is exactly what Paul's getting into. That's exactly what Paul gets into in the letter of Romans, talking about circumcision, eating certain foods, celebrating certain Sabbaths, all that stuff. So yeah, that's a fascinating point. I didn't even think about that. Yeah,
and then just thinking of like your own culture as the right culture just comes from a sense of pride.
That
some
is
sort
true,
of pride issue under there.
Yeah.